So I was then became a member of the university staff, a senior assistant in research, and shortly after that got married, and settled down a bit more in Cambridge and stopped travelling quite so much, and started then to have graduate students and have an ordinary professional life. And I myself was working on all these aspects of plate tectonics, but gradually getting less and less enthusiastic about it, because it worked too well, essentially. that you could it's a very simple notion which is now taught to school children, that the surface of the Earth consists of these rigid caps which are in relative motion, and that produces earthquakes, and when you push one underneath the other, that produces volcanoes and things like the tsunami in Indonesia and so on. And all this worked out just, once you've done it, it was basically trivial, right? And I wondered whether I was going to be one of these people who just had one really good idea and then lived off that for the rest of their life, because I really wasn't getting very far. And I decided to try to try and understand something which plate tectonics is really not concerned with, which is what is the mechanism which keeps the plates moving, right? How does all that work? And this is made much harder by the success of plate tectonics, because if all that you can see of the motions are the motions of these rigid caps, the motions underneath are fluid dynamics. They're much more like pouring water into a jug or something of that kind. But all you see of that is like the motion of the ice in the jug. You don't see any of the details of what's going on. So it was very hard to get any relevant observations, and that was what we did, and this was with Nigel Weiss, who was an astrophysicist who I knew in applied mathematics, was to do numerical models. Right? We built computer models of the behaviour of these fluids, and he did them from below and from within and things like that, and saw what they did. And we could have done this in the laboratory, but in some ways it's easier to do it on the computer. And we spent about 5 years doing this, right? And it was very successful. We got a great deal of understanding of the basic physics of this sort of process, which had not really been looked at before, because the difference between what happens in the oceans and atmospheres and what happens in the Earth is essentially due to the viscosity. In the oceans and atmospheres, the fluid motions have momentum, right? So, if you put up something and the wind blows against it, it will not, if it's not strongly put up, it will be flattened, right? And it's flattened essentially by the momentum of the air which hits it, and the same happens in water, right? This is the principle of water cannons, right, of how you control demonstrators by shooting water at them. You knock them flat, and it's the momentum of the liquid. Now, the mantle has no momentum. The flow in the mantle is so sticky that it's like, honey spreading. If you put a drop of honey on a table, it very slowly spreads out, but it hasn't got any momentum, right? And that's what the interior of the Earth looks like. And this was not something which the fluid mechanics people had up to at that point spent a great deal of attention on. So we got going first of all on the computers, and later in the laboratory, looking at what sort of flows did you get, what sort of cellular convection did you get, and whether we could see this on Earth. And this was really very successful from a sort of learning point of view. And then we calculated the surface influence of these things, and the gravity field of the Earth is principally controlled by the motions in the mantle. And this I'd realised when I was a graduate student, my thesis, my PhD thesis was on this topic. But by that time we had much better measurements of the gravity field from satellites and things like that. So we could actually see the circulation. And this was the one of two things which I did at that time, which actually made me think that I could have a life beyond plate tectonics. And the other one was the success of our work on the continents. I, by that time, had graduate students who were doing these things, and we were working in Iran in the field, and I was still looking at all these earthquakes. And we got a really good understanding of, first of all, how the continents moved, and then a little bit later of actually some completely new phenomena, right, which only occur in the continents and don't occur in the oceans, which are the development of sedimentary basins, and I'll come to that in a minute because that was the other really big thing which happened. So then I started to cheer up, right? That you know, because I got elected to the Royal Society in 1976, and by that stage I was essentially an assistant director of research, which is the equivalent of a lecturer. And the university was not very keen on promotions in those days, so I mean, they didn't even after that promote me to a readership or anything. I stayed as an assistant director of research for some years after that. But I wasn't terribly bothered, except I was rather poor and I was married. And I continued to go backwards and forwards to the States and to work with Americans and work with people all over the place, actually, at that time. So then I suppose the next really big thing to happen to me came from the work on the continents. And why the continents are so different is that plate boundaries in the oceans, you know, you have a sharp line between two plates, they separate or they come together, and up wells the mantle in between and melts and does various things like that. On the continents, and this is why the ideas had not been discovered on the continents, the deformation is distributed over huge areas. In Iran, the whole of Iran is being shortened. The whole of the Aegean is being stretched. Right? It's not concentrated. We still don't really understand why this should be, but the description of the motions is then quite different, because you've got to take account of the fact that it's not just on one fault. You know, you've got lots of earthquakes distributed over a large region. Right? You've got to actually then think about what that means and what differences that produces. And one of the differences that it produces is that if you stretch the continent over a large area, you make the cold part, which is the structure of the thing, is the structure of the Earth, is that there's a cold part which is the plates on the top, and then the convecting mantle underneath has more or less constant temperature almost down to the core. And so you've got a very steep temperature gradient near the surface, and then it's isothermal below that. Now, what happens when you stretch the thin layer at the top is that you make it thinner, and so you increase the temperature gradient because you do it quickly. And what then happens, and there's a whole lot of faults associated with that, because it stretches and you get earthquakes and all the rest of it. The mantle wells up into the hole underneath, right, and it's hot. And then the whole thing, after you stop stretching it, it cools. And as it cools, the whole thing contracts, and so the surface sinks. And this is the explanation of things like the North Sea. Right? The bottom, if you look deep in the North Sea, you see all these big block faults where there were earthquakes. And then that motion stopped, and then for the last, 100 million years or so, the North Sea has just sunk. And all the sediments in there were deposited in shallow water, and now at depths like 4 kilometres. And it's those shallow water sediments which produce the oil, because they're now buried so deeply, they've got hot again, and they've got hot, and the organic carbon breaks down and produces oil. So once we understood this, and this was I wrote this paper in the late 70s, 1978, based on what I'd found in the Aegean, not in the North Sea. And I wasn't at all interested at that time in these things which are called sedimentary basins, which is what I've just described. I was interested in continental deformation. But, you know, nothing is clear like that. You know, when you see something, it gives you other ideas. Right, so I wrote this paper, and unlike plate tectonics, which was for quite some time controversial, this explained all the details which the oil companies knew from drilling these basins, and put it all together in an extremely simple framework. And again, I could do all the maths analytically so that it was all really easy to code up on computers. And it was, even before it was published, it became totally accepted by all the oil companies, who just put everybody on it. And so I went, and rather to my disgust, this has become known as the McKenzie model of sedimentary basins, whereas I always call it the stretching model, because to call it the McKenzie model tells you nothing at all about the idea. And it annoys me that people do that. Right? But the fact that it's attached to my name meant that suddenly, in a completely different area of the subject, I became extremely well known. And I really only ever wrote one paper on this subject. But that was all that I needed to do, because it was so obviously correct. Right? And that was the beginnings of the feeling that I could do lots of other things. You know, all I had to do was to think straight and to be very careful. Right? And, you know, careful intellectually. Right, about what I understood and what I didn't understand, and separate the two cleanly, right, and then I work on the things which I didn't understand and have field programs and so on, right. And so I, in a sense, you know, grew up at that point and realised that, you know, I could turn my hands really to lots of different things if I really put an effort into it.
Did you benefit in any way from this oil companies?
Not at that time. No, it's probably. I mean, because doing anything in the subsurface, particularly offshore, is so expensive, and this gave them a fundamental understanding as to how to do all the calculations of, you know, the amount of oil being generated and everything else. It's probably benefited everybody by, you know, several $1 billion, probably between $5 and $10 billion, has been saved by using these ideas. But like all of science, I mean, you know, the understanding is separate from the commercial stuff. And what the oil companies do brilliantly is to use understanding of scientific problems to actually economize on drilling holes. Right. So I didn't at that time, I'll come to that bit later on, I didn't at that time benefit at all from it, because it was in the open literature, and in any case it would have been immediately transportable. I mean, it wasn't sort of stuck to me. I started, soon after that, I started a company here in Cambridge to try and actually benefit commercially from all this, and that was hopeless, right? Because what the oil companies actually wanted to do was to give you their data and you produce a report, rather than what I wanted to do, which was to teach them how to think about things in this way and let them do the work, right? So that I shut down. It lost a little bit of money, a few £100, but nothing to speak of. But I shut it down quite quickly because it really wasn't going to work. That was in the early 80s. I mean, why don't I talk a little bit about that whole business since then? That one of the people I worked with at the time, I was doing this work on sedimentary basins, and by the time this happened, I was quite grand, because I was I'd become a fellow of the Royal Society, and at the time I was elected, I was actually the youngest fellow of the Royal Society, which was really rather grand and nice. I worked with somebody called Andrew McKenzie, who's no relationship at all.
Spelt with the same McKenzie.
Spelt as with an A. He was at that time a graduate student at Bristol, and he was working on how these organic rich sediments actually broke down to produce oil. And the two of us thought that we could do something really rather clever with all this, which was to test the stretching models by using these reactions, the physical chemistry of these reactions, which he'd been studying. But what we hadn't realised was that these were organic chemists who'd done it, and they knew no physical chemistry at all. So they knew nothing about the physical chemistry of these reactions. So what we did was to say, all right, if you don't know anything about the physical chemistry, then we'll use the model to do the physical chemistry, do the problem backwards, which we did, and wrote a long paper on exactly how all this understanding could be exploited to look at the generation and migration of oil, of really, chapter and verse and which molecule you should look at, which particular hydrogen atom on which molecule gave the information, really very, very precise. And that paper had an enormous impact once we got it published. We had a lot of trouble getting it published. The people in this subject said, oh, we don't understand a word of this, it shouldn't be published. We said, look, that really isn't grounds for rejecting papers. So it was rejected twice, and then we gave it to a colleague of mine here at Cambridge who was a paleontologist, who was the editor of a journal called the Geological Magazine. And he submitted it through him. He was on the editorial board of the Journal of the Geological Society of London. And so we gave it to him and said, look, would the Geological Society consider publishing this? And so he read it in the train going down to the meeting and found it very interesting and quite easy to understand, even though he was a paleontologist. It went out to review and came back with these letters. And he said, look, these people really can't be very competent. They can't understand it, and I can understand it. I should publish it. So he published it in the Geological Magazine. Right. And that, I thought, was the end of that. I was very happy that it came out. But then it proceeded, and this is the only paper that's ever happened to me, it won the best prize in organic the prize for the best paper in organic geochemistry published that year. So we with some delight sent this to the editors who rejected it. And Andrew then went into BP and did research for a little bit. And then he was very clever, still is very clever, and he was interested in a career in an oil company rather than just being a researcher. And so he then went on a fast track promotion through BP and came out of that about 10 years later. I lost touch with him during that period. But then he became John Brown's right-hand man. And John Brown was by then the head of BP. And John had the idea that he wanted to start some research institutes, one in Europe, one in North America, and one in the Far East, in universities, because he believed, and I think he's quite correct, that a lot of the problems that BP faces, that there is some understanding of these problems already in the scientific community, but that BP didn't really have access to a very broad background of people with science backgrounds to know where to start finding out this sort of thing. And what he wanted was to set up these institutes to establish links with BP, with people in the university, so that when new things came up in BP, they could actually find out quickly, right, what was already known and how to set about it. And Andrew came to see me with essentially the idea of starting such an institute in Cambridge. And he and I put together this program, and this would now be, I suppose, about 10 years ago. And we wrote one side of A4 for the BP board and for the university to set up an institute with an endowment of £25 million. and it went straight through both BP and the university, right, without any modifications. And so we set up this BP Institute in Cambridge, and I must say it's the largest amount of money for the least amount of work that I've ever received.
How long did it take you to write this? You've been thinking about it.
We did it over a weekend, right? I mean, and both of us thought that neither the university nor the BP board would turn over the page. So we had to get it on one side of A4. We thought that they would read one side of A4. And we were quite right. They did read one side of A4, but not anything else. And what we wanted to do was to lay out the entire enterprise, both intellectually, financially, and actually how it should be managed. Right.
I'd love to see that.
Yes, I can send you it.
Because I'm trying to set up something similar, and it might give you an idea.
Well, it worked really worked for a number of reasons. One was that Andrew and I knew each other extremely well and completely started from the same point of view. And neither the university nor BP really had quite the same view initially. So we had a certain amount of explaining to do, but the university was happy because BP didn't want any commercial control on what was done or on publications or anything else, and the appointments it wanted to fund people who had absolutely standard, straight university contracts and held them in departments, right, in completely the normal way, and had completely a normal progression of career. And that made the university completely happy. BP spent, Andrew reckoned, about a week of somebody's management time on this thing, and that was considered exorbitantly expensive. It was only 25 million, right? A dry hull, if you drill a dry hull offshore, right, you spend about $50 million on one hull, right? And so the institute actually was set up, and within 2 years, the BP reckoned that they'd got a return on their entire investment, just because it had done a study of how to drill holes in one thing in the North Sea, and they had to drill one fewer hole than they were expecting, and that saved the entire cost of the institute.
You were director of this institute, right?
No, I wasn't. I set it up, but I had no intention of being the director. I did it really partly because I was interested in having much closer connection with BP, partly because if somebody comes and offers you 25 million to set up an institute, right, you'd be a real idiot to turn it down when it doesn't come with strings. And I was actually interested. There was no blueprint. I mean, we looked at various institutes in the States which were concerned with this sort of thing, and none of them really was what Andrew and I had in mind. So we were doing something completely from scratch, and it was much more an intellectual interest as to whether one could set something up like this which would work without having any design, without having anything to copy. And we did quite well. We got it fairly much right.
Was it a virtual? I mean, you didn't...
No, real. Physical.
Well, yeah.
And then I built the building.
There was a building.
No.
You built a building.
When we did the sums, it costs about £3 million to endow a professorship.
Yes.
And about 1.8 at that stage for a lectureship. And the building was going to cost us £2 million. So we said, well, let's not make do with some building. Why don't we start from scratch? So we built a building right next door to Bullard Labs, which is where I work. And the university turned around and said, well, you've got the money. You have a clear idea of what you want to do. Why don't you hire the architects and decide on the building? Right. So I then spent the next 2 years really being the building manager, which was quite interesting, but I wouldn't do it again, because it really does preoccupy you with, light switches and all that sort of stuff. But it was quite interesting. No, we.
So how much did you spend on the building in the end?
We overran quite a lot. The total cost was about 2.3 million.
Oh well, that's reasonable.
It started as about 1.8. We overran by about $500,000, and because BP is so concerned, I mean, put such emphasis on doing things to budget and to time, I couldn't go back and ask for any more money, so I had to find another $500,000 to finish it off, which I did. And then we hired Andy Woods to be the head of it and the professor, and that's worked out extremely well. And I'm on the management committee, which meets once a year, and I talk to Andy. But I'm not, I decided either I had to run it or I had to essentially pull completely out of it and let Andy run it, which is what I did. But BP then put me on their technology advisory committee, which I've now been on that for 6 or 7 years, and that's extremely interesting because it's a group of people who, some of them are academics, some of them, there's the head of technology for Sun Microsystems, for IBM, for Daimler Chrysler, and things of that kind. And when I first went onto this, I found it. I knew who was going to be on it, and I thought, heavens, this is really. I really don't have any claim to know anything about these things. And when I got on it, I discovered that they were absolutely like me and had just the same background. Indeed, the head of Sun Microsystems, technology for Sun Microsystems, had actually worked at Scripps in the same group that I'd worked in of the Seaborn Computer Group. And it was really strange. And he and I, absolutely see eye to eye, more than we do with some of my academic friends. And it's really been fascinating because we report directly to the board. We have complete clearance to look at any aspect of the entire company. And it's our job really to go around and say what we think about it. So, we just wander around the world looking at how BP runs its refineries or does its drilling or whatever. And it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm really delighted to have, because, it's a completely different world from being an academic, right? And one in which I'm now totally embedded in a way. I know exactly how things operate and what people will think and what their problems are and so on. And I found it fascinating.
You presumably, after a long time as an ADR, you then got a readership.
Oh yes, I should go back and do my more. And the dates I would have to look up. I don't really know what happened. I had some difficulty because Teddy wanted me to take over from him, and he retired in about 1971, when I would have been 29?
29, yes.
Yes. And I didn't want that job at all, any more than I wanted to go to Manchester and be professor there. So I didn't apply for his job. And after the closing date, he came to see me and said, I see you haven't applied. And essentially said to me that he wouldn't put me forward to be an assistant director of research unless I applied for his job.
I thought you already were an assistant.
This was 1971. I was an SAR.
SAR.
Which is like an assistant lecturer.
Yeah.
And he said he wouldn't put me forward for ad hominem promotion unless I applied for his job. So I thought, well, I really need promotion. I was married and I hadn't got the money. If I say no, then I'm probably going to have to leave Cambridge and do something which I don't want to do. If I say yes, hopefully, right, the electors will not elect me because I'm too young, right? So I applied, and I'm glad to say was not elected, which Teddy was cross about, but I wasn't. And Xavier Le Pichon, who I've already talked about, he was already. I mean, he's a little bit older than me, And he was one of the electors, and he told me afterwards he pushed very hard for me to be made professor, but it met total opposition. Right, I was far too young. So he got nowhere. And Jack Jacobs came, and Jack was nothing like as well known even at that stage as I was. And I did my best. I reckon that the a test of people in organisations is what they do when they have a not very good boss, right? Do they leave, or do they essentially say, well, all right, it's not forever? And I decided this wasn't forever, and I would make a real effort to get on with him, which I did. But I mean, particularly after I was elected to the Royal Society, and he wasn't, our relations were a bit strained, and so that he then wouldn't. I mean, in those days you couldn't apply personally for promotion, and he wouldn't put me forward to be promoted to be a reader until I really insisted. Right, so I didn't get promoted until the late 70s. Then what happened was quite interesting. What rather took me by surprise. The fact that plate tectonics and all the associated stuff had such an impact right across the earth sciences, and was still going further and further, even by the end of the 70s, meant that the divisions, the historical divisions between the different bits of earth sciences, between geophysics and geology and mineralogy and petrology, which at that stage were three completely separate departments, really made no sense at all. And the first of the three professorships to become vacant at the end of the 70s was in mineralogy and petrology. And it was offered to somebody in the States called Joe Smith, who was originally, British by birth, but was at Chicago. And he came over and looked at the place, and that department was really moribund. By that time, this would have been about 78, 79, it didn't even have any graduate students. It had got to that stage. It had been it originally was set up by somebody called Tilley, who was a real tyrant. And he was only interested in appointing people who would do what Tilley wanted them to do. And that's a recipe for disaster in departments. And so when he retired, and Alec Deere took over, I mean, it really was dying, right? And so Joe Smith turned it down and said this department's just useless, which was a fair statement, right, but was too narrow. And what they then did was very imaginative. They offered it to Ron Oxborough, who at that stage was a lecturer at Oxford, and he was originally trained as a geologist, but he'd done a lot of work in geophysics, and he would have been perfectly good as the head of the geophysics department in which I worked, or of the geology department, but he'd never done any work in mineralogy and petrology. So the appointment only made sense if you were going to put the departments together. And he then came here and talked to me, spent a whole evening talking to me about what my views were about doing that sort of thing. And I was totally in favour, right? And said, look, I didn't know what the views of my colleagues were there, but, by that stage I was a reader and I had tenure. I said, I'm coming in with you if you do that, and I will try and take the rest of them with me. And so Ron, on the basis of these conversations, accepted the job, and we put the three departments together. Jack was really opposed to that. And I'm afraid I just simply said, look, at this point, I'm going to take no notice of my head of department. I'm just simply going to see, I know this department very well, I know exactly how to deal with it, right? This is the thing which makes sense for us, we should do it, right? And I'm going in anyway, and I'm going to take everybody in with me who wants to come. And had a whole series of open meetings after tea where we got Ron to come and talk to us, we got the university people to come and talk to us, and it was completely open. It was held we did this after tea out at Bullard Labs. And because it had all being done secretly downtown, a lot of the people from the other two departments came and to listen to these people. And then I said, after we'd had 3 or 4 of these meetings, we're going to have a meeting at the end of next week, right, and after tea, to talk about all these things, and everybody who's present in the room will have a vote. So we had a meeting, and it was unanimous.
Really?
Right. And that was that.
Including Jack, or was he not there?
I don't remember. Jack, I think, voted. It was clear that it was going to go that way, so I think Jack then said yes. But graduate students, everybody had a vote, right? That was that. Right? And that was the end of the discussion, frankly. It never then became an issue, right? And there were various small things which people had got completely hung up about, like, whether we could continue to have our own telephone number, or whether we were allowed to use the Xerox machine without paying for it, whether this sort of thing was going to stay. And I said to Ron, look, all of these minor issues figure tremendously largely, they're trivial, right? If you've got any sense, basically, you will not change any of all this. We're a separate site, just leave it as it is and it will cause no problems. And now it's unthinkable that we shouldn't be part of the same department. I mean, it would be just awful. Right? And we weren't allowed to have anything to do with the undergraduate teaching. I, with tremendous effort, got 2 lectures on plate tectonics into the undergraduate syllabus by 1978. Right? That's 10 years after the whole theory broke. I went on sabbatical and they removed the 2 lectures. Because they were from somebody from a different department. Right? And after amalgamation, we just rearranged all the teaching, everything, and it was all done then sensibly.
And did you do much lecturing after that?
Yes, and I still do.
And you enjoy lecturing?
Yes, I do. I think I've been doing it for a bit long, and there are things which I now teach them, which they need to know, but there's no one else in the department can really teach it from their own research. And most of the things which were like that, other people, my former graduate students particularly, got involved with and then got university positions and have taken it on because it's their major research, and that was fine. And it's left me with a whole lot of things which nobody else has been involved in, which are really major issues, like mantle convection, what drives the plates, things like that, which I now have to teach because no one else really can. And I got a bit fed up with that because I want to teach some new things rather than doing this. Well, I did that for the first time for a long time this spring, and taught a course which was for the 3rd and 4th year undergraduates on new ideas really about the formation of Tibet and how that is a precursor to making these very old parts of the continents, which are very old and hard. And I think we understand how that whole progression now works. And they loved it, right? Because it was all completely new. A fair amount of it's not yet published, It's just the sort of thing which excites undergraduates. And I enjoyed teaching. It was much harder work than teaching my standard courses, but I enjoyed it very much. Right? But I do, I don't really want to do more teaching. And so it's a matter of shedding things, and I've tried to. But my colleagues are rather tough with me. So I don't look like being allowed to drop these things until I retire properly.
You retire in 2010, is it, or 9?
Well, yeah, the university rules have just changed. And historically, you retired at the end of the academic year in which you became 67.
That's right.
They've just changed that rule because of the EU thing on age discrimination, and you can now stay on after that if you want. And so I said to my present head of department that I would, provided I stay healthy, I will go until I'm 70 and then I will retire. So I will retire in 2012 if everything goes through as I suspect it will, because I had really a very strange career, because I mean, to go from being unknown to being the person who everybody invites to, every international conference when you're in your 20s. I was 25 when all this happened. I found really very strange. And as a result of that, I then been given all kinds of prizes and honours, which is very nice, but always seems to me a little bit irrelevant in a way. I mean, that some rich man, in all the cases I've won, it's been a rich man, has set up some international prize which some group of people who you don't know decide to give to you. And it's very nice, and it's made a lot of difference to my financial life, actually, because they've been really large sums of money. But it isn't really what I value. What I value is being taken seriously by the people who are now actively doing research. And that I've got, I mean, at the beginning, I suppose, I took these prizes much more seriously than I do now. What I like is the graduate students, the subjects got harder. Graduate students now are more apprentices than they used to be when I was a graduate student, when the subject was new. But young postdocs, people in their 20s and early 30s, who are really the driving force behind the subject. I mean, to be taken for your ideas to be taken seriously by them is what I now really mind about, and that's still the case. I mean, I'm still on top of that, and I work with a lot of them. I've always found it extremely easy to work with people who are both younger and older than I do. And as I've become grander, it's become actually easier, provided I don't stand on my high horse and don't expect to have my boots licked. If I'm just simply a scientist like them, they're very taken with the idea of working with me. And I've worked with all kinds of people very, very early in their career. I will only do so if I think they're clever. Right? They have to bring something to it.
How many graduate students, roughly, do you think you've had in your career?
I've decided last year I was going to take on no more. I've taken on, I suppose, about a graduate student a year, I would guess, since the middle 70s. So that's probably 30. I probably had about 30, I think. That's about the right sort of number. A lot of them have done extremely well, all over the place. I mean, James Jackson, who was last year elected to the Royal Society, quite a lot. Philip England, he was a postdoc of mine really, rather than a graduate student, who's now head of the Department of Oxford, also a fellow of the Royal Society.
You mentioned your work has had a big influence on other traditions in India and further north, maybe China and so on.
That's been because of the fact that once we started working on the continents, then on principle, I and the other people, my graduate students and so on, always work with scientists in those countries on an equal footing. We don't try and go it alone. And what we particularly like to do is to bring the bright young to Cambridge to do PhDs here on these topics, and then they go back, hopefully, back to their countries of origin and have an impact on the research there. That works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work. The worst experience was with Greece. You cannot get a job in a Greek research institute or university unless you did a PhD with a Greek professor in that place. Right? So our efforts there were completely fruitless. Right? When the graduate students went back, they were unemployable, right? And they left. But I mean, in some sense, although I was sad, for the individuals concerned, it was not so bad because they got extremely good jobs in the West when they left. The other sadness was with Iran. We had 3 graduate students from Iran before the revolution who were just full of enthusiasm for the revolution and went back. But, you know, they were tarred with a foreign brush by that stage. And it was not possible really for them to work there after the mullahs took power, and they all left. We're now back again with contacts there and working with them and doing various things, but I'm somewhat nervous that Iran is now going back. I mean, there's two opposing camps which pull in different directions very strongly, and the more fundamentalist one is now on the ascendancy, largely I think because of the reaction of the West to what's going on there. And you know, it's not that I criticise the West. I mean, you know, all our Iranian friends are quite clear that the state supports terrorism, right? And the notion of a terrorist organisation with nuclear weapons is pretty terrifying. They're all quite clear that Iran is in all this to make nuclear weapons, right? And hope that it succeeds, even our more Western friends. And I suppose I would have the same view if I was Iranian. So that's been a long-standing collaboration, especially with James Jackson, he did his PhD on Iranian earthquakes, and then
Atchison.
James Jackson.
Jackson, yeah.
Yeah, and he then became a staff member and at the Department of Earth Sciences, and is now one of our, you know, he is likely to take over as head of department next year. You know, he's become a major figure in the place.
Is that all right to be broadcast on YouTube?
But
is that all right to be broadcast?
Yeah, we've had long discussions in the department.
That's all right.
You know, it's not decided, but I think it's everybody regards it as a done deal. I think. No, we don't have factions like that. So he's worked with the Iranians now ever since he was a graduate student, and very closely and very productively. I have another colleague, Keith Priestley, who also works with the Iranians and with the Indians and with the Chinese. And we've had various Chinese graduate students from mainland China who've gone back, who we have close connections with. We also have a Mongolian who was a graduate student with us, who went back to Mongolia, who's now become one of the major scientific figures in Mongolia. And, you know, through him has opened up the whole of Mongolia to scientific research from people from the States and Europe. He's been tremendously effective.
Inner or outer Mongolia, do you know?
Outer, proper Mongolia. No, not China. Not China. I mean, we regard Inner Mongolia as part of China. And
the question I saved for the end is that you've already, in a sense, given an idea of what it is that makes a scientist: curiosity, drive, interest. But if you were advising a young scientist who's just starting on their career, have you any sort of tips or ideas? I'll give you one which I keep in my diary from Einstein. Unless an idea starts out as absurd, there is no use or no hope for it. Which I like, and other Einstein quotations. But I was wondering whether there's any advice.
I think that may be true if you have ambitions and the ability to become a second Einstein. The undercurrent of my life has been the exploitation of the understanding that the physicists have of all kinds of processes with which we come in contact in novel areas. And that will continue, I'm quite sure, to be a huge sort of area of fundamental research for as far in the future as I can see. I mean, the area which is slowly coming into sort of, you know, under the guns, if you like, is molecular biology. And that clearly is physics, right? It's not being yet thought of as physics, but all the control mechanisms, all the ways in which proteins fold, everything else, all of that is going to be controlled by straightforward, understood physical principles in the end. It's quite how you turn those physical principles into applying and understanding these things is far from clear. But my advice to anyone, I think, would be to start off by doing maths and physics as an undergraduate, and then to say, have baggage, will travel. And whenever I sort of prod people, for instance, who are in biology or whatever, about this, they say, we would just love to have such people come into the subject. They do extremely well, right? Whether it's simply the technology which they use, which is all based on physics, or whether it's the understanding, which is going to be based on physics. You just can't go wrong. And if you have control of the mathematics, you get so much for free, right? There's this whole apparatus of straight logic, which is just yours for the rolling out. You know how to use it. It will take you from A to B to C, right, as inevitable consequences of A, right? And you can see whether you can test it at B, you can test it at C, you can test it at D, it doesn't matter where, right? You can see whether it works. And it just all comes for free. It's marvellous. It's just like, Einstein did exactly that with general relativity. All the apparatus was there already in mathematics. And now we're at the edge of essentially the mathematics that we know how to use in physics. Progress is very, very slow. The business of trying to understand how to deal with the infinities and how to turn quantum chromodynamics into a predictive theory and what comes after that, and how to unify the very small with the very large and with gravity. All of that, nobody understands how to do. And the mathematical apparatus which people are trying to use to do that, string theory and stuff, they're doing the mathematics at the same time as they're trying to do the physics, and that makes it terribly, terribly difficult. And those people, most of the people in that, are not going to have the sort of careers that I had, unless they're absolutely brilliant. And, I was not a brilliant physicist. I was a good physicist, and it really appealed to me, but I wasn't good enough to do, fundamental particle physics and things of that kind. But I was quite good enough to use it and have really a wonderful career, right, beyond my wildest expectations, right, in the earth sciences. And the advice I would say is that unless you're of that caliber, to really shift physics thing, say right, learning maths and physics shows you what a subject looks like when it's understood. Now take that understanding, go off and use it on all these things which are crying out for that sort of people, for those sort of people, right? And you will have a wonderful career.